The night that was supposed to celebrate love instead became the moment everything quietly changed as laughter glittered louder than the chandeliers and a man stood smiling through humiliation while destiny waited patiently in his pocket. The ballroom glowed with gold light bouncing off crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors as music floated softly through the air and everyone believed they were about to witness another ordinary anniversary celebration. Tables wrapped in white linen circled the room filled with laughing guests dressed in elegance holding champagne glasses and phones already angled for gossip and spectacle. At the center of it all stood Marcus Taylor, calm, composed, wearing a deep blue suit that had been pressed carefully that morning even though he had barely slept the night before. His wife Renee Taylor stood opposite him glowing in sequins with a smile sharp enough to cut glass while her family and friends crowded close already feeding off the energy of anticipation. They called it love, they called it celebration, but what they really wanted was entertainment and Marcus could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, pressing against his chest. Marcus had always been the quiet one, the man who listened more than he spoke, the husband who believed patience could heal what pride kept breaking. Tonight was their 10th anniversary, a decade of smiles in public and silences at home, a decade of him carrying weight she never noticed. Renee lifted the microphone and laughter rippled before she even spoke, as if the room already knew something cruel was coming. She talked about struggle, she talked about disappointment, she talked about how hard it was being married to a man who dreamed too much and delivered too little. Each word landed softly, but together they formed a storm and Marcus felt eyes crawling over him, measuring him, judging him, enjoying the slow unraveling. Her sister laughed first, a sharp sound that gave others permission to follow, and soon the room filled with chuckles and whispers. Marcus kept his posture steady, shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward, because he had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only armor a man had. Then the cake arrived, towering layers of cream and gold carefully crafted by hands that never imagined what it would become. Renee turned toward him holding the plate, and for a moment time slowed as Marcus searched her face for mercy or hesitation or love. What he saw instead was resolve mixed with bitterness, fed by years of comparison and impatience. She said something about making a statement, about showing everyone the truth about who she married. Before Marcus could speak, before he could even blink, the plate flew forward and cake exploded against his face, thick and heavy, sliding down his cheeks and suit. Gasps burst into laughter and phones lifted higher as frosting dripped from his jaw and crumbs clung to his beard. Someone clapped, someone shouted, someone laughed so hard they had to lean on a chair, and no one noticed the way Marcus inhaled slowly to keep himself grounded. Cake fell to the floor in soft clumps while icing stained the front of his jacket, and silence never came. Renee stepped back, smiling, proud, as if she had finally won something that had been missing from her life. Marcus wiped his eyes carefully, refusing to smear the mess further, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He bowed his head slightly, not in shame but in control, as laughter echoed around him like applause meant for someone else. What no one in that room knew, what no one could have imagined, was that 12 hours earlier Marcus had been sitting in a quiet glass office signing documents worth $500 million. No one knew that the calm man they were mocking had just closed the deal of a lifetime after years of rejection, nights of doubt and mornings that began with prayer and persistence. No one knew that the phone vibrating silently in his pocket held congratulations from men who once ignored his calls. No one knew that the humiliation they were enjoying was the last moment they would ever have power over him. Marcus looked up slowly, cake still clinging to his skin, and met Renee's eyes, not with anger, not with tears, but with something colder, something final. The music continued, the laughter rolled, and cameras captured the moment that would soon circulate as a joke. Marcus stepped back, carefully excusing himself with a nod as if this was all part of the evening program. He walked toward the exit, leaving behind whispers, frosting footprints, and a marriage already hollow. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, wrapping around him like relief as he leaned against the marble column and closed his eyes. He took out his phone and for the first time that night allowed himself a small smile. A message sat at the top of his screen, simple, powerful, undeniable, confirming the deal, confirming his future, confirming that this was not his ending. Inside the ballroom, laughter still echoed, unaware that they were laughing at a man who had already outgrown the room. And as Marcus straightened his suit, wiped the last trace of cake from his face, and walked into the night, the real story finally began. The night did not end when Marcus stepped out of the ballroom, because humiliation has a way of echoing long after laughter fades, and tonight every echo followed him quietly into the dark. He walked slowly across the parking lot with his jacket folded over his arm, cake stains still visible on the fabric like evidence of a crime no one would admit committing. Inside the building the celebration continued, glasses clinked, music swelled, and Renee soaked in attention fueled by approval from people who mistook cruelty for strength. Her friends crowded around her, praising her boldness, calling it iconic, calling it deserved, calling it long overdue, while she laughed loudly, soaking in the validation she had been starving for. Someone replayed the video, already looping it on a phone screen, and the room burst into another round of laughter as Marcus's frozen expression became entertainment. No one asked how long a marriage survives when respect dies publicly. No one asked what kind of woman humiliates her husband for applause. And no one cared enough to wonder why Marcus never raised his voice, never lashed out, never begged. Outside, Marcus sat in his car, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing deeply as the quiet wrapped around him like a blanket. His phone buzzed again, another message, another congratulations, another reminder that while his world cracked in one place it had solidified forever in another. He remembered the meeting earlier that day, the glass walls, the firm handshakes, the moment the lead investor leaned forward and said, "We believe in you." He remembered signing his name slowly, deliberately, knowing this deal was not just money but proof that patience had not been wasted. $500 million backed by vision, strategy, and trust, the kind of trust he never received at home. Marcus had wanted to tell Renee earlier that morning. He had rehearsed the words in his head while tying his tie, imagining her smile, imagining pride replacing disappointment. But she had been distracted, rushing, complaining, criticizing, reminding him not to embarrass her tonight. So he kept quiet the same way he always did, believing timing mattered, believing love deserved the first reveal. Now that silence felt like prophecy. He started the engine and drove through the city streets, lights blurring past as memories surfaced, moments he once dismissed now revealing patterns he could no longer ignore. Renee mocking his ideas at dinner, Renee rolling her eyes when he spoke about long-term plans, Renee comparing him to men who made noise but built nothing. Her family joined in casually undermining him, joking about his ambition, laughing about his patience, calling him soft. Marcus had swallowed it all, believing endurance was love, believing if he just held on long enough respect would come. Tonight proved endurance without boundaries only feeds contempt. Back at the venue, Renee finally noticed his absence and shrugged it off, telling herself he would cool down like always. She posed for pictures, raised glasses, accepted compliments, while her mother whispered that it was about time someone put him in his place. No one noticed the subtle shift when a waiter whispered something into Renee's ear, asking if she wanted to approve the payment for the event. She waved it off, annoyed, telling him her husband would handle it later, unaware of the irony sitting inches away. Marcus arrived home to a quiet house, walls echoing with memories, and he stood in the doorway longer than necessary, taking in the life he had built and the life he was about to leave behind. He placed his jacket carefully on a chair, resisting the urge to throw it away, knowing this moment deserved clarity, not reaction. He poured a glass of water, sat at the table, and opened his laptop, not to work but to review the contract once more, grounding himself in reality. The numbers glowed back at him, undeniable, transformative, life-altering. For the first time that night he laughed softly, not in joy but in release. He thought about the man he had been tonight, standing still while cake slid down his face, refusing to flinch, refusing to retaliate. That restraint was not weakness, it was discipline. And discipline was what built empires. His phone rang, this time a call, and when he answered, the voice on the other end was calm, respectful, excited. They spoke about next steps, about press releases, about board seats and public announcements scheduled for the coming days. Marcus listened, asking questions, offering insights, already stepping fully into the future that awaited him. When the call ended he sat back, eyes closed, letting the weight of it all settle. He knew tomorrow the video would circulate, captions would mock him, jokes would fly, and strangers would judge without context. But he also knew something else, something deeper. Power does not announce itself in moments of humiliation, it reveals itself after. Renee returned home hours later, heels in hand, laughter still on her breath and irritation ready on her tongue. She expected silence, maybe tension, maybe an argument she could win. Instead she found Marcus asleep on the couch, peaceful, unbothered, unmoved. That unsettled her more than anger ever could. She stood there watching him, chest rising slowly, and for a fleeting moment doubt crept in. But pride pushed it away, reminding her that control was better than vulnerability. She went upstairs already planning how she would spin the story tomorrow. Marcus woke before sunrise feeling lighter than he had in years, as if something heavy had finally slipped off his shoulders. He showered, dressed simply, and left the house quietly without leaving a note. There was no need for words anymore. As the city woke up, Marcus stepped into a new day, not as a man recovering from humiliation but as a man preparing to reveal truth. And somewhere beneath the glittered laughter of the night before, a reckoning began to form, unseen, unheard, and unstoppable. Morning came quietly, but it carried weight as Marcus stepped into the day, knowing the world would soon speak about him without knowing him. The sun rose over the city, casting light across streets where people hurried to jobs, dreams, and disappointments, unaware that a shift was already in motion. Marcus walked into a private office building downtown, one he had visited many times before but never with his name officially attached to the door. Security nodded with respect, already informed, already briefed, already aware that this man was no longer just a guest. Inside, the elevator mirrors reflected a man calm, collected, and grounded, no trace of cake, no trace of laughter, no trace of yesterday. He adjusted his cufflinks, slowly, breathing in purpose, breathing out residue. At the anniversary venue, Renee woke late, scrolling through her phone, watching the video spread faster than she expected. Comments flooded in, some laughing, some shocked, some calling it savage, others calling it cruel. She focused on the praise, ignoring the few voices asking why a wife would do that to her husband. Her mother called laughing, telling her she had finally shown strength. Her friends sent messages saying the clip was everywhere, saying people loved it. Renee smiled, telling herself attention was power. She did not notice the absence of Marcus again. She did not notice that his side of the closet sat untouched. She did not notice the calm in the house that felt more like vacancy than peace. Marcus sat in a boardroom surrounded by men and women who listened when he spoke, who leaned forward when he explained, who respected silence as much as authority. They reviewed timelines, market impact, and rollout strategy for the deal. $500 million moved with intention, guided by a vision Marcus had been building quietly for years. One executive mentioned the viral video, hesitantly testing the air. Marcus acknowledged it with a small nod, saying public perception fades, results remain. That statement settled the room. By midday, calls came in from journalists requesting comment, interviews, and clarity. Marcus declined most of them, instructing his team to prepare a statement that focused on business, not spectacle. Renee, however, leaned into the attention, posting captions about empowerment, jokes about humility, and thinly veiled insults that fed her audience. She believed she had won the narrative. She believed Marcus would eventually respond the way he always had. That evening she arrived home to find suitcases gone, drawers empty, and documents neatly stacked on the table. Her chest tightened as she flipped through papers, recognizing separation filings prepared with precision. There was no anger in them, no accusations, no begging. Only finality. Marcus did not leave a letter because closure does not always require explanation. He left knowing truth reveals itself louder than words. Days passed and the story evolved. The deal Marcus signed became public, stock prices shifted, headlines changed, and suddenly his name appeared beside words like visionary, strategist, and industry leader. The same people who laughed shared articles in disbelief. Renee watched the news in silence, realizing the applause she chased had a short lifespan. Her phone rang less, her praise faded quicker than she expected. Meanwhile, Marcus stood at a podium announcing initiatives, partnerships, and future plans, his voice steady, his presence undeniable. Questions about his marriage surfaced and he answered simply, saying some chapters end quietly while others begin loudly. That quote echoed farther than the cake ever did. Renee felt the shift when invitations stopped, when friends grew distant, when her mother asked questions she could not answer. She replayed the moment over and over, watching herself throw the plate, watching his stillness, watching the room laugh. For the first time she wondered what it cost her. Marcus moved forward unburdened, building something larger than validation. He understood now that dignity delayed is not dignity denied. And as his influence grew, the memory of that night transformed from humiliation into contrast, the line between who he was and who he became. The city watched quietly, recalibrating its judgment. And somewhere in the silence between applause and consequence a lesson settled in. Some men do not rise by shouting, some rise by enduring. And when they stand, the ground beneath everyone else begins to shake. The world did not turn overnight, but something subtle shifted as Marcus continued moving forward while the echoes of that anniversary night slowly lost their grip. Morning routines became structured, meetings replaced memories, and purpose replaced pain as Marcus settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar yet right. He moved into a temporary penthouse arranged by his team, a quiet space overlooking the city where sunrise felt like promise instead of pressure. Every window reflected a version of him that had survived humiliation without becoming bitter. Meanwhile, Renee woke each day checking her phone, hoping for another wave of attention, another comment, another reminder that she still mattered. But the algorithm moved on, audiences always do, and the laughter that once felt powerful now felt hollow. Friends who once encouraged her boldness now avoided long conversations, unsure of where loyalty belonged. Her sister stopped sending memes, her mother stopped laughing, and silence crept in, replacing applause. Renee replayed the video again late at night, not for entertainment but for answers. She noticed details she had ignored before: Marcus's stillness, the way he never flinched, the way his eyes never begged. For the first time she saw strength where she once saw weakness. Marcus, on the other hand, sat in strategy sessions discussing acquisitions, expansion, and leadership initiatives. People listened closely, taking notes, asking for his insight. He spoke about discipline, about patience, about building quietly while others chase noise. His story resonated because it was real. An assistant informed him that several of Renee's relatives had reached out requesting meetings, introductions, and favors. Marcus declined politely, without malice, without revenge. He understood boundaries better now. News outlets began reframing the viral moment not as comedy but as contrast. Articles surfaced questioning public humiliation in marriages, discussing respect, dignity, and private battles. Marcus never commented, letting the narrative mature on its own. Renee watched these discussions unfold, realizing that the spotlight had turned not against Marcus but against her. Strangers dissected her actions, calling them unnecessary, cruel, short-sighted. The same crowd that cheered began questioning. That shift unsettled her more than any argument ever had. One afternoon Renee drove past the old house where Marcus used to sit in silence, absorbing her frustrations. She parked across the street, watching the windows, wondering how it all slipped so far. She remembered moments he tried to share, ideas, dreams, possibilities. She remembered dismissing them, believing security came from flash, not foresight. Marcus stood on a stage later that week addressing young entrepreneurs, sharing lessons learned without naming pain. He spoke about humility, resilience, and knowing when to walk away. The audience listened deeply because his calm carried truth. Renee attended a family gathering where whispers followed her from room to room. No one laughed now, no one joked. They asked how Marcus was doing, asked about the deal, asked why she let him go. Those questions cut deeper than mockery ever did. She defended herself, at first blaming stress, blaming misunderstanding, blaming him. But the words felt thin. That night she sat alone, scrolling through old messages, photos, and memories, realizing she had mistaken endurance for indifference. Marcus never needed to prove himself to those who doubted him. He only needed to remain himself long enough for the truth to surface. As weeks passed, Marcus finalized his move into a permanent residence, choosing simplicity over excess. He invested time into mentorship, community projects, and long-term vision. His fulfillment no longer depended on applause. Renee attempted to reach out, sending messages, testing the silence. Marcus read them calmly, choosing not to respond immediately. Not out of cruelty but clarity. He knew conversations without respect only reopen wounds. Eventually he replied with a short message, wishing her well and setting boundaries that felt final. Renee felt the weight of that restraint more than any argument. She realized control was never power, respect was. And respect once lost does not return easily. Marcus continued forward, grounded, focused, and free. The memory of cake and laughter faded, replaced by purpose and momentum. The anniversary night no longer defined him. It defined the moment he chose himself. And somewhere in the quiet distance between who they were and who they became a truth settled firmly. Humiliation may draw laughter but character writes legacy. The distance between who Marcus had been and who he was becoming widened quietly but powerfully as days folded into weeks and every step forward felt lighter than the last. He woke each morning with clarity instead of tension, with purpose instead of explanation, and with a sense that his life finally belonged to him. The city responded to momentum the way it always does, with doors opening, conversations shifting, and names being spoken differently in rooms that once ignored him. Marcus moved through those rooms with ease, never rushing, never boasting, never correcting assumptions, because he no longer needed permission to exist fully. The $500 million deal began to ripple outward, creating jobs, partnerships, and attention that carried his signature style of calm authority. Executives who once hesitated now sought his counsel, investors listened carefully, and younger founders studied him not just for success but for composure. Marcus noticed how often people asked about resilience, and he answered by saying, "Peace comes when you stop negotiating your worth." Those words spread because they came from experience, not performance. Across town, Renee felt time moving differently, slower, heavier, and louder in its silence. She had lost the audience before she realized how much she depended on it, and now the absence of noise felt unbearable. Her phone no longer buzzed with praise but with questions she could not answer and curiosity that felt like judgment. Family gatherings became tense, her friends' conversations shallow, and her confidence began to fracture under reflection. She found herself remembering details she once dismissed, like the way Marcus listened fully or how he never raised his voice even when provoked. Those memories arrived uninvited, carrying regret she was not ready to face. She told herself she had needed excitement, validation, and control, but those words no longer satisfied the ache she felt. One afternoon, Renee visited a cafe they once frequented, hoping familiarity might comfort her, but instead it reminded her of the quiet strength she once underestimated. She watched couples talk, laugh, and disagree gently, and for the first time wondered when love had become performance instead of partnership. Marcus spent that same afternoon reviewing proposals with his team, discussing long-term impact rather than immediate gain. He emphasized sustainability, integrity, and leadership rooted in responsibility. They listened because his calm carried weight, his silence demanded attention, and his decisions reflected depth. Later, he received an invitation to speak at a national conference on leadership and transformation. He accepted, knowing his story was no longer about proving anything but about offering perspective. As preparations began, media interest grew and interviews focused less on the viral moment and more on his philosophy. Marcus spoke thoughtfully about dignity under pressure and the strength required to walk away without bitterness. Those interviews resonated widely, shifting public conversation from spectacle to substance. Renee watched one of them late at night, hearing his voice steady, confident, and grounded. She felt something twist inside her, not jealousy, not anger, but recognition. She had underestimated the man beside her because she had mistaken quiet for lack of ambition. The realization sat heavy because it arrived too late. Days later, Renee attempted to attend a social event, hoping to reclaim some sense of belonging, but found herself standing alone as conversations drifted away from her. The laughter felt forced, the smiles temporary, and she understood for the first time how quickly attention moves on. Marcus, on the other hand, found fulfillment in spaces that valued substance over spectacle. He began mentoring young leaders, sharing lessons learned through patience, humility, and self-respect. Those sessions grounded him, reminding him why he endured so much without breaking. He never framed himself as a victim because he understood growth requires responsibility even for what you tolerate. That insight became a cornerstone of his leadership approach. Meanwhile, Renee faced practical consequences as well. Finances changed, relationships strained, and independence felt heavier than expected. She had relied on Marcus's steadiness without appreciating it, and now stability felt unfamiliar. One evening she opened old photos from their early years, moments filled with laughter, hope, and simplicity. She realized love had been present once, genuine and supportive, before impatience took its place. The weight of that realization brought tears she could no longer suppress. Marcus received a message from a mutual acquaintance mentioning Renee's struggles and asking if he felt any regret. Marcus paused, reflecting before responding honestly, saying growth sometimes requires loss and that compassion does not mean returning to harm. That response reflected his evolution: clarity without cruelty, firmness without resentment. As time continued to pass, the anniversary night became a reference point rather than a wound. People spoke about it differently now, as an example of contrast between humiliation and composure. Marcus allowed that narrative to exist without attaching himself to it. He understood his life was no longer defined by one moment but by consistent intention. Renee eventually sought therapy, seeking understanding, not justification. She spoke about control, fear, and the pressure to appear strong. Those conversations opened doors she had avoided, and while they did not undo the past, they offered a path forward. Marcus continued building, expanding, and investing in both business and community. He found satisfaction in progress measured by impact, not applause. And as seasons changed, both of their lives moved in different directions, shaped by choices, consequences, and growth. The man who once stood still while laughter filled a ballroom now stood firmly in his truth, unshaken and unapologetic. The woman who once sought validation through spectacle now learned the cost of mistaking attention for respect. Their stories diverged but remained connected by one undeniable truth. How you treat someone when you think they have nothing reveals who you are when they have everything. Time continued its quiet march forward, and with every passing day the weight of that anniversary night grew lighter on Marcus's shoulders, while its meaning grew heavier in everyone else's memory. The city had a way of rewriting stories once truth surfaced, and now when people mentioned Marcus's name, it was no longer paired with laughter but with respect, curiosity, and influence. He moved through his days with intention, beginning mornings early, walking through quiet streets, allowing himself moments of reflection that once felt impossible. He thought about the version of himself who stood still while cake slid down his face, and he did not feel shame toward that man, only gratitude. That man had chosen restraint over reaction, dignity over chaos, and patience over pride. Without that moment, Marcus understood he might never have fully seen the cost of staying silent in spaces that demanded his shrinking. His company expanded steadily, drawing attention from international partners and leaders who valued his measured approach. Meetings grew larger, responsibilities multiplied, and yet Marcus remained grounded because he had learned the difference between noise and substance. He hired people who reminded him of himself years earlier: talented, overlooked, patient, and underestimated. He created environments where voices were heard without competition and where respect was not conditional. Those choices built loyalty faster than any bonus ever could. Meanwhile, Renee's days were filled with introspection that arrived uninvited and lingered longer than comfort allowed. Therapy sessions peeled back layers she had carefully constructed, revealing insecurities she once masked with control. She spoke about growing up believing love was proven through dominance and attention rather than partnership and trust. Those realizations were painful because they reframed memories she once celebrated. She began to see how often she had dismissed Marcus, not because he lacked ambition but because his ambition did not resemble the chaos she associated with success. Family dynamics shifted as well as her relatives slowly distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the mirror Marcus's rise had placed before them. The same jokes that once bonded them now felt hollow and awkward. Renee attended gatherings less frequently, choosing solitude over judgment and learning to sit with her thoughts rather than distract herself with applause. Marcus received invitations to events he once watched from the sidelines, and he attended selectively, choosing spaces that aligned with his values. At one gala, a speaker referenced the anniversary incident, indirectly praising composure under pressure, and Marcus listened without reacting. He understood that vindication did not require public acknowledgement, it required private peace. Later that night, a young entrepreneur approached him, sharing how that story had changed the way he responded to disrespect. Marcus listened, offering guidance rooted in experience, not theory. He explained that strength is often misinterpreted until it stands alone long enough to be undeniable. Those words traveled farther than he expected, shaping conversations in rooms he would never enter. Renee struggled with moments of loneliness that arrived unexpectedly. She missed the stability Marcus provided, not because it was exciting but because it was consistent. She realized consistency is often invisible until it disappears. One evening she attended a small dinner where someone mentioned Marcus's upcoming keynote speech. The table grew quiet and eyes shifted toward her, waiting for a reaction. Renee forced a smile, nodding politely while feeling the weight of her past decisions settle deeper. She excused herself early, walking home through streets filled with couples' laughter and conversations that echoed what she had lost. That night she wrote in a journal for the first time, not to perform but to understand. She wrote about fear, comparison, and the pressure to appear superior. Those pages did not absolve her, but they allowed honesty to emerge. Marcus prepared for the keynote, carefully crafting a message centered on leadership, self-respect, and resilience. He did not mention humiliation or betrayal. Instead, he focused on the quiet choices that shape outcomes. The speech resonated deeply, drawing standing ovations and invitations to collaborate across industries. As he stepped off stage, Marcus felt a sense of closure, not because the past was erased but because it no longer defined him. Renee watched the speech online alone, recognizing the calm authority she once mocked. She saw the man she married clearly for the first time, not as a supporting character in her story but as a protagonist in his own. That realization brought a mixture of regret and acceptance. She understood she could not rewrite history, but she could learn from it. Marcus received a message from her days later, congratulating him sincerely without request or expectation. He read it slowly, appreciating the growth reflected in its tone. He replied briefly, thanking her and wishing her continued healing, maintaining boundaries without bitterness. That exchange marked a quiet end to a chapter neither needed to revisit. As months passed, Marcus invested more into community initiatives, focusing on mentorship, education, and opportunity. He believed success held little meaning if it did not uplift others. Those efforts grounded him, reminding him of his purpose beyond profit. Renee continued her personal journey, rebuilding her identity outside of comparison and control. She learned to celebrate others without diminishing them, a lesson that arrived late but remained valuable. Their paths no longer intersected directly, but the impact of their shared history lingered as a lesson for those who observed. The story that began with laughter and cake ended not with revenge but with transformation. Marcus emerged not hardened but refined, carrying dignity earned through endurance. Renee emerged humbled, learning that power gained through humiliation fades quickly while respect built through compassion endures. And the world watching learned quietly that the truest measure of strength is how one behaves when the room is laughing and the future is waiting silently in their pocket. The final chapter did not arrive with noise or spectacle, because the loudest transformations rarely announce themselves and the deepest conclusions often settle in silence. Years later, people would still mention the anniversary night as a reference point, but not for the laughter, not for the cake, and not for the cruelty. They spoke of it as the night a man was tested publicly and chose restraint over reaction, dignity over ego, and patience over destruction. Marcus Taylor stood now in a different place, not just physically but internally, a place shaped by experience rather than approval. The skyline outside his office windows stretched endlessly, reminding him that horizons expand when fear contracts. He often thought about timing, how life reveals truth only when it knows you are ready to carry it. If the deal had come earlier, he might have stayed. If the humiliation had come later, he might have broken. But everything arrived in the order it needed to. His company now employed thousands across multiple cities, creating opportunities for people who once felt invisible. Marcus made it a point to walk through offices without announcement, shaking hands, listening, asking questions, remembering names. He understood power does not need distance to survive. Young professionals often asked him how he handled disrespect so publicly, and he always paused before answering. He told them strength is not proven by what you destroy in anger but by what you preserve in restraint. He explained that reacting gives your power away while responding keeps it rooted. Those lessons became part of the culture he built, quiet, strong, and enduring. At home, Marcus lived simply, choosing peace over performance. He filled his space with books, light, and moments of stillness. He learned to enjoy silence not as absence but as presence. Some evenings he sat on his balcony watching the city breathe, reflecting on how far he had come and how little bitterness he carried. He did not pretend the pain never happened, he simply refused to let it live rent-free in his future. Renee's life moved forward differently, slower but more honestly than before. She no longer chased rooms that clapped loudly, she chose spaces that spoke truthfully. Therapy continued, not as a phase but as a commitment. She learned to question impulses before acting and to sit with discomfort rather than weaponize it. She rebuilt relationships carefully, owning her mistakes without demanding forgiveness. Some people accepted, some did not, and she learned to respect both outcomes. She eventually found work centered around community outreach, helping others navigate conflict, communication, and accountability. Her story became one of caution rather than spectacle, and she carried it with humility. She spoke openly about the cost of confusing control with strength and how easy it is to humiliate those who love you when you feel small. Those who listened felt the weight of experience behind her words. There were moments when memories surfaced uninvited, the laughter, the cake, the cameras. But instead of shame she felt resolve, knowing she would never repeat that version of herself. Marcus and Renee crossed paths once years later at a charity event. There was no tension, no resentment, only quiet acknowledgement. They exchanged brief words, respectful, measured, and sincere. Both understood that their growth no longer required proximity. That moment passed without fanfare but carried more closure than any argument ever could. The world continued to tell their story in fragments, headlines, speeches, conversations, and lessons passed quietly between people who needed them. But the truth remained steady beneath it all. Humiliation is temporary, dignity compounds. Laughter fades, character echoes. And the man who stood still while cake slid down his face did not lose that night. He won something far greater than revenge. He won himself. Marcus Taylor never sought to embarrass those who laughed at him because life handled that through contrast and consequence. He understood that success spoken softly lasts longer than success shouted. His legacy became one of calm authority, purposeful leadership, and unwavering self-respect. People remembered him not for what was thrown at him but for what he refused to throw back. The anniversary night became a lesson told in rooms far from that ballroom. A lesson about patience, timing, and the danger of underestimating quiet strength. It reminded people everywhere that how you treat someone when you believe they hold no power reveals everything about who you are. And it proved that sometimes the greatest response to humiliation is silence paired with preparation. Because when preparation meets opportunity, no laughter can drown out the sound of destiny arriving. And somewhere deep in the memory of that glittering room, now long forgotten, the echo of laughter finally disappeared, replaced by a truth that endured. Never mock a person whose future you cannot see. Especially when they are standing calmly with 500 million reasons not to explain themselves.